Well, this morning we are continuing our series on generosity, and this is our second week in our Practicing the Way series. And for those that weren't here last week, one of the things that we do twice a year is we focus in on a spiritual discipline, something that we can put into practice in our lives because we believe that we are shaped not by what we believe, but what we do, by our habits. The things that we do with our lives is actually what shapes what we believe and think. And so one of the things that we're going to be focusing on throughout this series is this idea of generosity, and in particular, Jesus' generosity, not just financially, but with his whole life, lived a life of generosity. And so through this series, we're looking at what does it look like to follow the way of Jesus when it comes to this generosity. Getting into this, though, I wanted to say that one of the things that I know is true for me, and I'm sure I'm not the only one, but one of the things that makes it difficult to be generous in our day and age is that there is an unlimited number of things competing for a limited amount of money that each of us has. Right? And so there's things like Amazon out there where you can just search endlessly for all the things that you could ever spend money on. But on top of that, not only that, but we are constantly being shown the things that we have a desire for through advertisements. One of the statistics I read this week is that on average, we probably view somewhere between 3,000 and 5,000 advertisements a day. A day. That's 1.1 to 1.8 million advertisements a year. And one of the things that I think is important for us to understand just about our reality is that a fundamental part of our reality is we operate in an economic system that thrives on discontentment. And that's not a statement on a particular economic system and merits or vices, but it's essential to understanding how our system works on us individually and why on a deep soul level, you and I have been formed for discontentment. And not only have we been formed for discontentment, but we've been informed that more is the solution to our discontentment. A telling moment for me in this was back when they released the first Apple Watch. I don't know if you guys remember this, but one of the versions that they released was a gold version of this watch that was $10,000. And I remember thinking, who is going to buy this watch? But the way that they sold it, the way that they talked about it was this was going to be a family heirloom that would be passed down from family to family, like a Rolex. And I remember thinking, no, it's not. Like, this is in an industry that thrives on producing products that sell because they render the previous models obsolete. Right? This is not going to be a family heirloom. And you can only play the family heirloom card once. Right? Like, it's not second version. No, seriously, this one, though, you guys, is going to be the family heirloom. And so what I'm talking about here is the myth of more. The myth that contentment comes through the accumulation of more things. And I call it a myth because it operates with the mental influence of truth. Like, you hear it and you're like, yeah, if I can just get this thing, then I'll be happy. Then I'll be content. But when we actually reflect on our reality, when we reflect on our past experience, we realize that actually the more we get, the more we want. Because it's feeding this habit in us that when we feel discontent, the solution is more. We have a word for this, and that word is greed. Greed or avarice. And avarice is not a word that we use a whole lot, but whenever I hear the word avarice, I think of Jim Carrey's The Grinch. And this is one of my, not just favorite Christmas movies, but favorite movies of all time. And I had somebody after the last service tell me that somebody looked over them and they were like, you and Ike are the same kind of weird. I was like, okay, whatever. But there's this part in The Grinch where he's talking to the Who's about avarice, and he says, the avarice never ends. And then he imitates them. I want golf clubs. I want diamonds. I want a pony so I can ride it twice, get bored, and sell it to make glue. And then he says, look, I don't want to make waves. But this whole Christmas season is STUPID, in case there's any kids in here. It's demonstrating this, I want. And one of the things that John Mark Comer says that I had never really thought about before this week's video for the Practicing the Way series, but he said that as a pastor, he has had people confess all kinds of things to him all kinds of dark things, painful things, but he's like, I've never had anyone come and confess, I'm just such a greedy person. I was like, yeah, I don't think that's ever happened. I don't think that's happened to me. In terms of greed, greed is similar to lust, but it is a lust for things. And he defines greed this way. He says, greed is dissatisfied and racked by the desire for more. Contentment is the opposite. It is free of the desire for more. And so the first thing that I want to name up front is just to acknowledge that we are all susceptible to greed. We are all vulnerable to greed. And so this week, I want to look at some of Jesus' teachings and how ultimately Jesus' desire is for us to be free for contentment and the lightness that contentment can bring to our lives. So we're going to be in Luke chapter 12, beginning in verse 13. And it goes this way. Someone from the crowd said to him, Teacher, tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me. Friend, he said to him, who appointed me a judge or arbiter over you? He then told him, Watch out and be on guard against all greed, because one's life is not in the abundance of his possessions. There's a couple of observations I want to make about this passage. The first is to say that this was not an uncommon scenario in ancient Palestine, meaning it wasn't uncommon for someone to come to a rabbi and ask them to settle this kind of matter. What was most likely going on here is that this was most likely the younger brother of an older brother who had inherited all of his father's inheritance. And one of the things that they did, the reason they did this is that in an effort to keep the property together, they would pass it down to one of the children. And that would mean that the other children, they could come live on the property, but it didn't actually benefit them in any way financially. And so that's the first thing. But the second thing is, because Jesus knows the hearts of men, that's what John tells us, Jesus detects this man's anxiety. And more importantly, the false belief behind his anxiety. That false belief is that life is found in having an abundance of possessions. And so Jesus' word to this man is, you are tied in knots over this inheritance, but I want you to know it can't give you what you most desire. And so it leads us to ask the question of ourselves as we read this, what do I desire money to give me? What do I desire wealth to give me? And can it actually give me that? And so as Jesus is talking to this man, essentially what he says is, let me tell you a story about a man who's on the other side of what you're wanting. A man who already has the abundance of possessions. Let me tell you this story about him. Verse 16, then he told them a parable. A rich man's land was very productive. He thought to himself, what should I do since I don't have anywhere to store my crops? I will do this, he said. I'll tear down my barns and build bigger ones and store all my grain and my goods there. Then I'll say to myself, you have many goods stored up for many years. Take it easy. Eat, drink, and enjoy yourself. But God said to him, you fool, this very night your life is demanded of you, and the things you have prepared, whose will they be? What Jesus is saying with this story to this man is, look, here's a man who is living your dream. He has more wealth than he has room to store. He's retired early. He's set for life. The kid's college is paid for. The DVC membership is purchased. He's out of the minivan. But what Jesus is saying, and yet it did not add life to his life. It did not get him one more day of life. And so with this story, it's a story that is easily misunderstood. It's easy for us to draw the wrong conclusions from what Jesus is saying here and then kind of dismiss it. And so I want to give you three things that this story is not saying, and then I want to give you three things that this story is saying. The first thing that this story is not saying, let me be clear. The first thing that this story is not saying is the story is not saying that money or wealth is evil. There can be great things that are done with money, and there can be great evil that is done with money. But the conclusion that we should not come to is that money is neutral. I think our mentality can be, well, it's not good or bad, it's neutral. But what I think Jesus is wanting to say here is, it may not be good or bad, but it is powerful. And what that means is that it has a powerful sway over our hearts. The ways that it can drive us to compromise our values. The way it can lead us to ignore the suffering of others. The ways that it can destroy families. And what it can do to lead us to align with evil people for our own gain. In short, it may not be good or evil, but it would be naive to ignore its power to corrupt. Last week, Sharon gave an illustration from Lord of the Rings, and so I want to continue that this week. And in the Lord of the Rings, you have this ring that is forged, and it has this certain power that comes with this ring. And what we see as we watch this movie is everyone who gets their hands on this ring, it immediately begins to corrupt them. It immediately begins to take control over them and leads them down dark paths towards evil things. And yet, the thing with Frodo Baggins carrying this, essentially what we learn is only the purest of heart stand a chance at not being corrupted by this ring's power. And I think a similar thing is true with money. We would be naive to ignore its power to corrupt. The second thing that the story is not saying, the story is not saying that it's bad to save money or to prepare for the future. I think the false conclusion we might come to is that, well, Jesus is saying it's bad to save, and so that's bad financial wisdom, so I'm just going to discount this story. And I want to acknowledge I don't think that's what Jesus is saying here. And then lastly, I think it's important to be clear that this story is not saying God will smite you for a financial misstep. I think we need to be clear on that. So what is this story saying? Well, there's three things that I do think this story is saying. The first one is that money and wealth is deceitful. In another passage, Jesus is talking about what it looks like for the word of God to be sown like a seed into different kinds of soil. And one of the soils that he talks about the seed of his word being sown among is among thorns. And so Jesus says this, he said, others are like seed sown among thorns. These are the ones who hear the word, but the worries of this age, the deceitfulness of wealth, and the desire for other things enter in and choke the word, and it becomes unfruitful. Jesus uses this phrase, the deceitfulness of wealth. What he's talking about here is how wealth promises what it cannot give: happiness, security, and satisfaction. And the reason it cannot give that is because it always says, just a little bit more, then you'll be happy. Just a little bit more, then you'll be secure. Just a little bit more, and then you will be satisfied. To bring this home a little bit more, there's a study that was done that I've shared with you guys before, but I want to share it again just because it just illustrates this so well. They did a study several years ago where they went to people of different income brackets and asked them one question: how much money would be enough? And so they started with those who made an annual income of about $30,000, and they said, how much would be enough? And they said $60,000. And then they went to those that made $100,000 a year, and they said, how much would be enough? And they said $250,000 a year. They went to those who made $500,000 a year and said, how much would be enough? And on average, they said $1 million. And then they went to those who had an annual income of $1 million and said, how much would be enough? And on average, the response, $5 million. That at all of these points, you think, okay, that would be enough, and yet it's not. And I want to be clear at this point that greed is not an amount of money. It's not as if once you've reached this amount of money, then you're greedy. This is more a condition of our heart and where our trust lies. Another one of my favorite Christmas movies, and I don't know why Christmas movies are prominent in this, except that I guess there's a lot of Christmas movies about generosity. But another one of my favorite Christmas movies is The Muppet Christmas Carol. Anybody else? Yes. With Michael Caine. And one of the things that's so powerful about this movie is that you can quite literally just feel the weight of Scrooge's greed. the ways that it just weighs down his life, the way that it is destroying his relationships, the ways that it is creating discontentment and disgruntled and just unhappy. And at one point, we see him with the ghost of Christmas past, and they're viewing this period of his life where he's sitting with his fiancée, and his fiancée is asking him about when they're going to get married and why they're putting it off again. And Scrooge responds, well, business continues to be poor. And his fiancée responds, that's what you said last year. And you've got a man sitting here who is clearly doing just fine financially. But you can see the way that his greed and his fears are preventing his relationships from moving forward. And the implication is that ultimately she walked away because there was no hope for their future relationship. And so there's this weight that comes with greed, this weight that it puts on our life. And another thing to understand here is that enough can't be a feeling. You can't just wait to feel like you've got enough. A part of the reason being it's not based on anything objective. And so one of the things I might encourage you to do is to determine what are some objective measures for when we have enough. I'm not a financial planner, so I'm not going to give you specifics, but I do encourage you to think through, at this stage in your life, what does it look like for us to have enough, and let that be a guiding principle for you going forward, so that when you do receive a raise or more income of some sorts, you can figure out how to be generous with that, not just raise your cost of living so that you still have no financial margin in your life. But the other thing that I want to say is that having enough is not always just about making more money. G.K. Chesterton said this. He said, 2 ways to get enough: accumulate more and desire less. That having enough is not always about just making more, but some of us maybe need to simplify our lives. Determine some things that maybe we could cut out of our lives, things that we could do life without that actually would allow us to breathe, to exhale, because now there's a level of margin in our lives. The second thing that this story is saying is the story is saying that money is a false god. I know that some are uncomfortable, want to be clear with the idea of talking about money in church. Or a pastor talking about money, and many for good reason. I want to acknowledge up front that there are churches and preachers who have done great financial evil in God's name. And yet, we must still talk about money because money is a deeply spiritual issue. The reason I say that is because there is nothing that competes more for our dependence on God than our dependence on money. There's another verse that I'm sure you're familiar with. Jesus is talking. He says, you cannot serve both God and money. And there are some translations that say you cannot serve both God and mammon. And that word mammon is an Aramaic word that scholars believe was the name for the ancient Syrian god of wealth. And so Jesus, referring to it as mammon, this was Jesus' way of saying money is like a rival god. And as we said earlier, money or wealth has this powerful capacity to affect our souls. When we look at our world, we see entire sectors of our economy devoted to the worship of mammon. We see that there are evils and injustices done in the name of the god of mammon. Wars, racism, ecological devastation. And therefore, what Jesus is saying is you cannot serve both God and mammon. Not that you should not that it's not a good idea, but that you cannot do this. Not because it's bad, but because it is impossible. Their values are diametrically opposed. And this mammon is a false god. It promises what it cannot deliver, which is life. It cannot deliver on that promise. We see in this story, after serving the god of mammon until he finally had enough, it did not add one day to his life. And I don't know about you, but I don't want to spend my whole life in the worship of mammon so that one day I can really live. Only to find out I could have been living in the freedom of contentment all along. Finally, the third thing that the story is saying money is an obstacle to the good life. And that may be counterintuitive in our culture, in our world. We think of it as the path to the good life. But the story concludes this way. He says, "This is how it is with the one who stores up treasure for himself and is not rich towards God." The one who stores up treasure for himself but isn't rich towards God. If the good life is characterized by contentment and satisfaction and peace, then the pursuit of wealth is contrary to that, because enough is never enough. The new thing is always getting old, and we're never satisfied beyond the initial joy of acquisition. And so it's a path that just keeps going. It doesn't actually lead to the destination we believe that it will. It reminds me of the quote from John D. Rockefeller, who was asked how much money is enough, and his response was, just a little bit more. And so as we look at this story, I think the question that we're left with then is, if it's not wrong to save for the future, where is this man's fault? Why does Jesus say that this man was a fool? Well, I think at the heart of his foolishness and the heart of his fault is that this man never saw beyond himself. When we look at the parables that Jesus told, no other parable is so full of the words I, me, my, and mine as this one. In this parable, we hear the word my 4 times. And in the Greek, the word I appears 8 times. What that means is it's indicative of this ingrained selfishness that this man lived with, that he saw all of life with. And one New Testament commentator, William Barclay, writes this. He said, when this man had superfluity of goods, the one thing that never entered his head was to give any away. The Romans had a proverb that went like this: money is like seawater. The more you drink, the thirstier you become. And so one of my takeaways from this story, and it's a takeaway I want to share with you today, is when we look at this story and we see that when his barns were full, maybe the question was not, do I tear down my barns and build more to store more? But maybe the question was, my barns are full. Whose barns are empty, and how can I help? And so the question that I would encourage you to ask, and that I've been asking myself, is, what are my barns? What are the indications that maybe it's time to look beyond myself? And as I was thinking of some objective examples here, some of the things that came to mind were things like when I'm hitting my retirement contribution limits on 401k and IRAs and still looking for ways to avoid taxes on income, it might be time to look to make a deposit elsewhere. Our barns may be getting full. Augustine, writing in the 4th century, put it this way. He said, if the objective is riches that cannot be lost or destroyed, the bellies of the poor were a much safer storeroom than his barns. And so some of my barns, as I've been thinking about this, and it's somewhat comical, but one of my barns is my jeans drawer. Do I really need another pair of black jeans? Another one would be the shelf that my boots are on. I'm looking at you, Stephen Pappas. We share love for Thursday boots. But when that shelf is full, maybe I've got enough. Another one, and I want to be clear, this is not a judgment on anyone. There are good reasons for having these, but it is a personal limit. But that is, whenever I begin to wonder, do I need a storage unit? I hold myself accountable to say, when I need an extra place to put my stuff, maybe I need to get rid of some stuff. Another one, not to name names, but a closet full of throw pillows and blankets. I want to ask you, what are your barns? What are the things that indicate, hey, maybe it's time to look beyond myself? I want to wrap this up by going back to this Muppets Christmas Carol. At the end of Muppet's Christmas Carol, we see Scrooge wakes up from his last dream and he discovers that it's not too late. It's not too late for him to change. It's not too late for him to repair these relationships. It's not too late to change his perspective on finances. And so what we see is Scrooge going around with this new perspective on finances, and he gives to the people who are taking a collection for the orphanage, and he gives so much that they faint. He buys this giant turkey to throw a feast for the town. He gives Bob Cratchit a raise. And for the first time in the entire movie, you see Scrooge smile. And what you're watching at this point in the movie is that Scrooge is beginning to feel the lightness of generosity, the freedom of generosity. And I want to encourage you this morning, I want to invite you to understand that God wants to set you free for generosity because it is so much lighter than greed. And most importantly, when we look at the story of Jesus and we look at the story of God's provision for his people throughout Scripture, what I want you to know is that what you are searching for in money, you already have in God. That whatever it is you are searching for in money, you already have it in God. And I know that may be a difficult thing to grasp. But if there's nothing we learn from this story, it's that this man had everything he could ever want, and it did not provide another day of life for him. And so if you find yourself in that place of how am I going to get through another day? Where's the finances going to come through? How am I going to survive? We can look to the stories where people were at their wits' end in the ways that God provided in miraculous, incredible ways because of their dependence on him. And so I want to close by inviting you just to bow your heads. I want to invite us into a moment of reflection and to begin to ask, where does my dependence really lie? Is my dependence on the God of Mammon? Is that who I run to? Or is my dependence on God? Maybe for you, it's beginning to ask, what are my barns? What are the things that I need to begin to see as signposts to begin to look beyond myself? As we take this time of prayer, our prayer team will be available. I invite you, if you would like someone to pray with you, they'll be available. But let's take this moment to reflect.